Esoteric schools. Two ideas present particular difficulties to understanding: the idea of esotericism, and the idea of psychological method. It cannot be denied that in general, these ideas are very far from modern thought. It becomes necessary therefore to have some conception of the meaning of these two ideas, and to show ways of approach to them. First of all, both ideas need the recognition of the fact that human thought can work on very different levels. The idea of esotericism is chiefly the idea of higher mind. To see what this means, we must first of all realize that our ordinary mind, including the mind of a genius, is not the highest possible order of human mind. The human mind can rise to a level almost inconceivable for us, and we can see the results of the work of higher mind, those most accessible to us, in the Gospels, in Eastern scriptures, in the Upanishads, in the Mahabharata, in the Emerald Tablets, in constructions such as the Great Sphinx at Giza, and in other memorials, though there are few surviving in literature and art today. The true valuation of the meaning of these and similar memorials, the realization of the difference between them and others which have been created by ordinary man, or even through genius, needs experience, knowledge, and a special training of the mind or perception. Perhaps special faculties not possessed by everyone. In any case, nothing can be proven. The first step towards understanding the idea of esotericism is the realization of the existence of higher mind, that is a human mind. One which differs from the ordinary as much as, say, the mind of an intelligent and educated grown-up differs from the mind of a child of 6. A genius is only a wunderkind. A person of higher mind possesses a new knowledge which ordinary man, however clever and intelligent, cannot possess. This is esoteric knowledge. Whether people of higher mind exist now and have existed always, or whether they appear on earth only at long intervals, is immaterial. The point is that they exist, and that we can come into contact with their ideas then, through these ideas with esoteric knowledge. This is the essence of the idea of esotericism. In order to understand what is meant by psychological method, it is necessary to realize first that the ordinary human mind, the one that we know, can also work on very different levels. Then to find the relation of the psychological method to the esoteric method. We can see different levels of thought in ordinary life. The most ordinary mind, let us call it the logical mind, is sufficient for all the simple problems of life. We can build a house with this mind, obtain food, know that 2 and 2 make 4, that the river Thames flows into the English Channel, and that horses eat oats and hay. In its proper place, the logical mind is perfectly correct and quite useful. But when the logical mind meets with problems that are too big, and when it does not stop before them, and instead starts out to solve them, it inevitably falls down, loses touch with reality, and becomes in fact defective. To this defective mind and defective method of observation and reasoning, humanity owes all superstitions and false theories, beginning with the devil with a goose's foot, ending with extremism, fundamentalism, and psychoanalysis. A logical mind that knows its limitations, and is strong enough to withstand the temptation to venture into problems beyond its powers or capacities, becomes a psychological mind. The method used by this mind, that is psychological method, is first of all a method of distinguishing between different levels of thinking, and realizing the fact that perceptions change according to the powers and properties of the perceiving apparatus. Psychological mind can see the limitations of logical mind and the absurdities of defective mind. It can understand the reality of the existence of higher mind and of esoteric knowledge, see it in its manifestations. This is impossible for a merely logical mind. If a man of logical mind hears about esotericism, he will immediately want to know where the people are who belong to the esoteric circle, who has seen them, when and how he can see them himself. If he hears that for him, this is not possible, he will then say that it is all nonsense, and that no esoteric circle exists at all. Logically, he will be quite correct. However, psychologically, it is clear that with such demands he will not go far in his acquaintance with esotericism. A man has to be prepared, that is, he must realize the limitedness of his own mind and the possibility of the existence of another higher mind. Nor will esoteric ideas, that is, ideas coming from higher mind, say much to a logical man. He will ask, for instance, where are the proofs that the Gospels were written by people of higher mind? Where indeed are the proofs? They are there, everywhere, in every line and in every word, but only for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. The logical mind, however, can neither see nor hear beyond a very small radius of the most elementary things. This limitedness of logical mind renders it powerless, even before quite simple problems of ordinary life once they go beyond the limits of its accustomed scale. Proofs are by no means necessary in order to accept or to deny a given proposition. There are psychological proofs, which mean much more than facts, because facts can lie and psychological proofs cannot lie. But one must be able to feel them. The term psychological method comes from psychological proofs. On the basis of these proofs, it is possible to see the defects of logical thinking in regions inaccessible to it or in questions too big for it. In exactly the same way, it is often possible to see the direction in which lie probable solutions to problems which seem, or appear to be insoluble. But this does not mean that with the help of psychological method it will always be possible to find solutions to problems too difficult or too big for logical mind. Real solutions can come only from higher mind, possessing higher knowledge, that is, from esotericism. This is the difference between psychological method and esoteric method. Try then to imagine the four methods of observation and reasoning in relation to the room in which I am now sitting. The defective method is based upon a glance at the room through the keyhole or through a narrow slit. Its characteristic feature is the certainty that what is seen through the keyhole or the slit represents all there is, and that there is and can be nothing else in this room except what is visible in this way. Given a certain imagination and a tendency towards superstition, the defective method can make something very strange or monstrous out of an ordinary room. The logical method is based upon a glance at the room from one definite spot, at one definite angle, and usually without enough light. Too big a confidence in it and the defense of this angle of vision makes the logical method defective. The psychological method compared with the first two would be like a view of the room in daylight, moving about in it in various directions, knowing the objects in it and so on. It is quite clear that it is possible to learn more about the room in this way than by the logical method, and that it is possible to find many mistakes and wrong conclusions of the defective method. The esoteric method of approach to the study of the room would include not only the whole room with everything it contains but the whole house, all the people in it with all their relationships and their occupations. Further, the position of the house in the street, of the street in the town, of the town in the country, of the country on the earth, of the earth in the solar system, and so on. The esoteric method is limited by nothing and always connects every given thing, however small it may be, with the whole. Examples of psychological, logical, and defective thinking abound everywhere. Occasionally we meet with the psychological method in science. In psychology itself, the psychological method leads inevitably to the recognition of the fact that human consciousness is merely a particular instance of consciousness, and that an intelligence exists which is many times superior to ordinary human intelligence. Only a psychology which starts from this proposition and has this proposition as its foundation can be called scientific. In other spheres of knowledge, psychological thinking lies at the root of all real discoveries, but it usually does not keep long. This means that as soon as ideas which have been found and established by the psychological method become everybody's property, and begin to be looked upon as permanent and accepted, they become logical and in their application to phenomena of a greater size, defective. For instance, Darwin, his discoveries, and his ideas were the product of psychological thinking of the very highest quality. But they had already become logical with his followers, and later on, they became undoubtedly defective, because they stood in the way of the free development of thought. This is exactly what Ibsen's Dr. Stockman meant when he spoke about aging truths. There are truths, he says, which have attained such an age that they have really outlived themselves. When a truth becomes as old as this, it is on the best way to become a lie. Believe it or not, truths are not such long-lived Methuselahs as people imagine them to be. A normally constructed truth lives as a rule, say, 15, 16 or at most 20 years, seldom longer. But such aging truths become terribly lean and tough. The majority, having first of all been created by them, later recommends them to humanity as healthy spiritual food. However, there is not much nourishment in such. All the truths belonging to the majority are like ancient rancid bacon or like rotten green ham, and from them come all the moral scurvy that is eating itself into the life of the people around us. The idea of the degeneration of accepted truths cannot be expressed better. Truths that become old become decrepit and unreliable. Sometimes they may be kept going artificially for a certain time, but there is no life in them. This explains why reverting to old ideas when people become disappointed in new ideas does not help much. Ideas can be too old. But in other cases, old ideas may be more psychological than the new. New ideas can be too logical and therefore defective. We can see many curious examples of the conflict between psychological and logical thinking, which then of necessity becomes defective in various intellectual reforms of old habits and customs. Take for instance reforms in weights and measures. Weights and measures that have been created through the centuries, and which are different in different countries, appear at first glance to have taken one or another form by chance, and to be too complicated. But in reality they are always based upon one definite principle. In each separate class of things or material to be measured a different divisor, or multiplier is used. Sometimes very complicated, as in the English system of weights, 16 ounces to a pound, 14 pounds to a stone for comparatively small weights, and for larger 28 pounds to a quarter, 112 pounds to a hundredweight, 20 hundredweight to a ton. Or for instance, a simple multiplier like 8 in the Russian measurement of grain, which is never repeated in relation to anything else. This is real psychological method created by life and experience because, thanks to different coefficients in different cases, a man making mental calculations involving the measurement of several different materials, cannot confuse either objects of different denominations or the measures of different countries, should he have to deal with the measures of different countries. Each order or multiplier itself tells him what is being measured, and with what measure. Those who do not like these old complicated systems are the school teachers, as is well known, the most logical people in the world. Different weights and measures seem to them unnecessarily confusing. In 1793 the convention decided to replace existing French measures by one natural measure. After lengthy and complicated scientific activity and research, such a measure was acknowledged as being 1/10,000,000th of 1/4 part of the Earth's meridian, which was called a meter. There is no direct proof of it, but I am sure that the idea of a natural measure and the metric system was born in the minds of teachers of arithmetic. Because it is so much easier to divide and multiply everything by 10, having done away with all other divisors and multipliers. But for all ordinary necessities of life, the metric system of weights and measures is far less practical than the old systems, and it weakens to a considerable degree a man's ability to make simple mental calculations, which is very marked in countries where the metric system has been adopted. Everyone who has ever been in France remembers the French shopkeeper's pencil and paper on which is often written 5 5/10, 5/5/10, but there are very few who know that this is one of the conquests of the Great French Revolution. Exactly the same thing takes place in attempts to change the old orthography. All orthographies must certainly be adapted to new requirements, perhaps once in 100 years, and this takes place of itself in a natural way. But violent reforms such as the introduction of so-called phonetic spelling, only so-called because real phonetic spelling is impossible in any language, generally upsets the entire trend of the normal development of a language. Very soon people begin to write in different ways and then to pronounce in different ways, that is to adapt pronunciation to the new spelling. This is the result of the application of the logical method to a problem that goes beyond the limits of its possible action. It is quite clear why the process of reading and writing is not a process of reading and writing letters. It is a process of writing words and sentences. Consequently, the more words differ from one another in their form and appearance, the easier does the process of reading and writing proceed, and the more they resemble one another, as is inevitable in phonetic spelling, the slower and more difficult is the process of reading and writing. It is quite possible that it is easier to teach phonetic spelling than normal spelling, but for the rest of his life the man who has been taught in this way is left with an unsatisfactory instrument for learning other people's ideas and for expressing his own. This is exactly what happened in Russia. Just before the revolution, a commission of teachers, there is no doubt of it in this case, under the presidency of the rector of Moscow University was formed for the investigation of ways to reform spelling. This commission worked out an absurd new spelling totally unsuited to the Russian language, breaking all principles of grammar and contradicting all the laws of the natural development of the language. This spelling would never have been accepted if the academy and literary circles had had the time to express their opinion on it, if the revolution had not occurred at that moment. But having got into power, the Bolsheviks introduced this new spelling, and under its influence the language immediately began to deteriorate, to lose its strength and clarity. If phonetic spelling were to be introduced into English-speaking countries, the English language would very quickly disappear and 20 or 30 varieties of Pidgin English would take its place. What could be more logical than the Holy Inquisition with its tortures and burning of heretics? Or Bolshevism, which began by destroying schools, universities, and technical institutes, in this way cutting off its own supply of trained specialists. What can be more logical and, at the same time, more unsuccessful than all possible prohibitions, like the American experiment in prohibiting alcohol? And what can be easier? Any fool, if he has the power in his hands, can find something to prohibit and in this way show his vigilance and good intentions. All this is the result of the logical method. The danger of the logical method in all possible spheres of life lies in the fact that at first glance it is the easiest and the most effective way. The psychological method is much more difficult and, in addition, it is often very disappointing because, by following the psychological method, a man often sees that he does not understand anything, and does not know what to do. Whereas by following the logical method he always understands everything and always knows what to do. Using logical thought we create a world surrounded by artificial positivist bounds, then proceed to live in this desiccated, sterilized environment, calling it real. So whence forth thither? In amongst all this chaos we sense at the same time that beneath it all lies strange meaning in old fairy tales. A world beckons where woods, rivers, and mountains become living beings. Mysterious life fills the night as we dream of distant travels, recalling extraordinary things heard about old monasteries and temples. Ideas and feelings, long since passed over, assume significance and interest. Deep meaning and many subtle allegories appear in what only yesterday might have been naive popular fantasy or crude superstition. The greatest mystery and the greatest miracle is that the thought becomes possible that death may not exist, that those who have gone may not have vanished altogether, but exist somewhere and somehow, and that perhaps we might see them again. We are accustomed and trained to thinking scientifically, and afraid even to imagine there may be something else beyond the outer covering of life. We are like men condemned to death, whose companions have been hung and are reconciled to the thought that the same fate awaits us. Then suddenly, we hear that our companions are alive. That they have escaped and there is hope for us too. We are afraid to believe it, because it would be so terrible if this proved to be false and nothing would remain but prison and the expectation of death. Books like The Occult World, Life After Death, Atlantis and Lemuria, Dogma et Ritual de la Haute Magie, Le Temple de Satan, The Sincere Narrations of a Pilgrim, which talk of life after death, are very naive. But they do lead somewhere. There is something behind them, something familiar. However, we prefer to flee from it all, to the bare and arid desert of positivism. The fourth dimension. This is the reality we seek, where we discover that people are only shadows, silhouettes of themselves. The whole of life is only a shadow, a silhouette of some other life. And so we begin a search, find a thread, lose it, search again, find and lose it yet again. Until at last a certain whole becomes formed in the mind. We trace that unbroken line of thought and knowledge which passes from century to century, from age to age, from country to country, from one race to another. A line deeply hidden beneath layers of religions and philosophies which are in fact only distortions and perversions of the ideas belonging to the line. We discover a literature full of significance which was up until now quite unknown. But which suddenly becomes quite clear to us, and feeds the philosophy we know, although it is scarcely mentioned in textbooks on the history of philosophy. Who knows, for example, that an ordinary pack of playing cards contains a profound and harmonious philosophical system? This, so entirely forgotten that it seems almost new. We search still further and see that it is perfectly possible to make the ideas of this hidden thought agree with the data of exact knowledge, realizing that the fourth dimension is a bridge that can be thrown between the old and new knowledge. We see and find ideas of the fourth dimension in ancient symbolism, the tarot in the images of Indian gods, in the branches of a tree and in the lines of the human body. We need, however, the help of a school. The question of esoteric or occult schools contains much that is not clear. We have no doubt that such schools exist, but cannot say whether it is necessary to assume the physical existence of such schools on Earth. Sometimes it seems that true schools can only exist on another plane, and that we can approach them only when in special states of consciousness without actual change of place or conditions. Which leads to the question of esoteric succession. Is it possible to admit an uninterrupted historical succession, or does the possibility exist of mystical succession? The line on Earth breaks, goes out of our field of vision, leaving only traces in its wake only to reappear in works of art, literary memorials, monuments, myths and religions. After long intervals of time, the same causes which once created esoteric thought beginning to work once more, and there begins a process of collecting knowledge. Schools are created and ancient teachings emerge from their hidden form. This would mean that during the intermediary period there may be no full or rightly organized schools, only imitation schools or schools that preserve the letter of the old law, petrified in fixed form. Which leads to yet another question. Should one and can one try to do something here and now with an obviously insufficient knowledge of method, ways, and possible results? Given various methods of breathing, dieting, fasting, exercises of the attention and imagination, and above all of overcoming oneself at moments of passivity or lassitude. In answering this question, opinions can be divided. It does not matter what one does, only that one should do something, and one should not sit and wait for something to come of itself. The whole point is precisely to do nothing until one knows surely and definitely what should be done to attain a definite aim. If one begins to do something without knowing what is necessary for what object, this knowledge will never come. The result will be the work on oneself of various occult and theosophical books, that is make-believe. In many cases it is perhaps useless to try. How can one try to paint a picture? How can one try to read Chinese? One must first study and know, that is, to be able to do it. However, in this last argument there is much desire to evade difficulties, or at the very least to postpone them. The fear of amateurish attempts at work on self is great, and one feels that it is impossible to go blindly, that one must see or know where one is going. If, in the midst of this process of search, we find we begin to change, we might perhaps be satisfied with something quite different from what we wanted to search for. It seems this is precisely what happens to people on the road of occult search. They begin to try various methods on themselves and put so much expectation, so much labor and effort into these attempts that in the end they take the subjective results of their efforts for the results of their search. So what are we then to do?